Uh, Hi everyone, welcome to our Policy Seminar for June 2021. We're thrilled today to welcome Josh Watkins, who joins us today from Singapore, from the National University of Singapore, where he works in the Global Studies Program and Department of Political Science. Josh teaches in a range of areas around global studies, but he's here today to share with us his really interesting research on migration. On which he's been researching for a number of years, particularly around asylum and refugee policy. So I'm going to hand straight over to Josh. Thanks for joining us. We'll hear some highlights from Josh's research, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion at the end.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. As was just said, my name is Dr. Josh Watkins, and I'm a lecturer of global studies in the Department of Political Science at National University of Singapore. I have some slides that I would like to share, so I'm going to go ahead and share those now.
While you're sharing them, Josh, I forgot to do a welcome to country. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on unceded territory in Australia, and we're all joining us from different locations. And here in Melbourne, we're on Wurundjeri land. So I thought I'd just pop that in while you were sharing your slides. So thank you.
Thank you. So, everything visible? Okay. So the presentation today is going to focus on a paper that I have developed for a special issue on refugee responsibility sharing and border externalization in Globalizations Journal, which is edited by your very own Amy Netherly. And I'm very honored to have been invited to contribute to that special issue. And Amy has, of course, done a fantastic job organizing the special issue and editing it. The study is a case study of what I call Australia's moral geography of forced migration management from 1976 to 1999. And this is part of a broader project that I've been working on for about a year, conceptualizing and analyzing what I call moral geographies of migration management. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a slide or two. But essentially it's looking at asylum seeker policy, refugee policy, and border militarizations, externalizations, and securitizations there within. So the key findings that I want you to take away from the presentation are the following. Firstly, that moral geography shapes states' approaches to refugee, asylum seeker, and border security policy. Secondly, that scale, particularly in the Australian case, become parts of states' moral geographies of forced migration management. So refugee policy, asylum seeker policy, border security policy is what I mean by forced migration management. And of course, Australia's moral geography of forced migration management has been shaped by conceptions of scale, specifically first of the region, starting in the mid-1970s, and then the global, starting in the early 1980s. So moral geographies are socially constructed and hegemonic expectations that we have about how places should be used, what's socially acceptable behavior in particular places. So you can behave this way in a football stadium, you can behave this way in a skating rink, you behave this way in a library versus how you're allowed to behave in a beach. So these are social codes, socially police codes about who belongs where, how they should behave there, and why. And what I want you to take away from the lecture is that moral geographies, these expectations about who belong and who doesn't, how we should behave in certain places versus other places, shape states' approaches to refugee, asylum seeker, and border security policy. That these social codes, these moral geographies about place and mobility influence which refugees and asylum seekers we see as legitimate versus illegitimate, queue jumpers versus those who came the right way, belonging versus those who are seen as undeserving or unwanted. So scale, like moral geographies, is a concept primarily from human geography. And what I mean by scale are these socially constructed conceptions, these discursive conceptions about spatial boundaries, relationships, and patterns. Imaginaries like the local or global or household or regional or global that influence how we think and how we act. It's never quite clear where the local starts or where it stops or where the neighborhood or region starts and stops. But what is very clear is that conceptions, these spatial imaginaries, influence the way we think and the way we behave. And they become collective action frames, influencing political mobilizations and political behavior. So what is meant by the politics of scale is when scale, these conceptions of the local or the neighborhood, become parts of political agendas. And they most certainly have become part of forced migration management, refugee policy, debates about immigration and refugee issues. So these value-laden perceptions about near and far, who's part of the region, who's not part of the region, who belongs where and why, which mobilities are authorized versus unauthorized, are very much infused within our ethics around refugee issues, around asylum seeker issues, around border security issues, unless they become parts of our moral geographies of forced migration management. Who is in or out of place? Who belongs where? Who should be disqualified based on how they got there? So, and across the history of the international refugee regime, where refugees or asylum seekers are from, how they got to where they're currently at, when and why, have significant implications for how states treat these asylum seekers, who are socially constructed as queue jumpers or not belonging or irregular migrants, versus who came the right way, who's in the queue. And particularly influential has been the notion of the region. Whether a refugee is part of a state's region or not has been significant, has been highly influential to whether or not a particular state will grant those refugees and asylum seekers asylum, how those refugees and asylum seekers will be treated, versus if they're seen as extra-regional, not from our neighborhood, if you will. So kind of tying this all together, when I talk about moral geographies of forced migration management, I'm advocating taking a holistic approach to conceptualizing forced migration management. I'm arguing that practices, refugee policy, border security policy, asylum seeker policy are relational to one another. Practices of exclusion like border enforcement, border externalization, migration management done abroad, securitizations of particular refugees as threatening, how these manifest in particular practices of exclusion are relational to other practices of inclusion, which refugees are deemed worthy and how they're treated based on that constructed worthiness. So acts of inclusion like resettlement and aid programs that target certain refugees as belonging, distress worthy of assistance have to be thought of in connection to other acts, other ideas of exclusion, who doesn't belong. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard, and it's particularly relevant in the Australia case, that these irregular boat arrivals threaten to crowd out these legitimate refugees that came the right way, that are in the queue. So these ideas of inclusion and exclusion have to be understood as related to one another. And what I want to get across in this presentation is that Australia's the underlying logic of Australia's moral geography of forced migration management has been influenced by these ideas of inclusion and exclusion, but also by scale. And that first, the region was imagined as bringing with it a special obligation to regional asylum seekers. Yet later, this idea became challenged and delegitimized by ideas that Australia actually owed a responsibility to refugees wherever they may be. And that actually this politics of scale, this idea that Australia now owes an obligation to the world's refugees rather than just specifically to Southeast Asian refugees or the region's refugees, was very much an idea that was put forth to delegitimize the notion that the region brought with it special obligations. So again, that relational connection between ideas of inclusion and exclusion. And of course, when we think about Australia's refugee policy, this all has to be put in context of the Indo-Chinese refugee exodus from 1975 to 1996, where 3 million asylum seekers, refugees fled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, the Indo-Chinese refugee exodus was managed through 2 international agreements. First, the Orderly Departure Program from 79 to 89, and then the Comprehensive Plan of Action from 89 to 96. And Australia was actually instrumental in getting both of these programs, these international agreements, started, initiated, and agreed upon. And what I want to get across is that the foundational logics of Australia's approach to forced migration, refugees, asylum seekers, boat people, can really be found during these times from 75 to 96. The foundational logics were kind of articulated and developed during this time, and these last to this day through the Pacific Solution to the contemporary Operation Sovereign Borders. I'm not arguing that these ideas have been static. They have evolved, and that's key to my argument. But what I am saying is that while certain aspects evolve, other aspects have continuity to them, going back to the mid-1970s. So an early conception of how Australia should approach refugee issues, forced migration management, was that the region had certain capacities and brought with it certain obligations. So the Fraser government, in rejection of the previous administration, really advocated both publicly and privately that the Australian government, that the Australian people had a special regional obligation to refugees fleeing Vietnam, Laos, and later Cambodia. And that Australia's emplacement within this region, never fully defined, not necessarily Southeast Asia, maybe more Asia Pacific, or Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but regardless, Australia's regional emplacement brought with it the special obligation to refugees in the region. And this map is the first map ever produced in a report on refugee policy from an Australian report on refugee policy from 1976 called Australia and the Refugee Problem. So from the very beginning, the refugee problem was conceptualized as regional, even though Australia had, up until 1976, resettled some 300,000 refugees or quasi-refugees. But the refugee problem was nonetheless conceptualized as regional. And you see across government documents all kinds of discourse about a regional responsibility to refugees, these obligations, these facts of geography that brought obligations to Southeast Asian refugees, really that the region brought forth certain capacities that led to certain obligations for the Australian government. And this, of course, was a major change. Just a few years before, the White Australia policy was enforced and then ultimately dismantled. And then just a few years later, the Australian government would initiate a policy, a refugee program that would ultimately resettle 137,000 Southeast Asian refugees. New immigrants that would have been inconceivable, generally speaking, during the White Australia policy. And what drove the logic that drove this, the moral geography forced migration, the underlying logic was this notion that the region brought with it this obligation. And this wasn't just linguistic, it was performative. So this notion of this politics of scale was performed by the Australian government, the Department of Immigration, into being through various acts. So of course you saw resettlement for encamped refugees across Southeast Asia. You saw asylum provided to boat arrivals. You saw the deployment of immigration officers across Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, etc., Hong Kong, Singapore. You saw the opening of new immigration offices in Bangkok to process, as well as Malaysia, to process these asylum seekers. You saw naval search and rescue operations rescuing boat people. You saw the development of new visa programs, humanitarian visas, refugee visas. You saw the Department of Immigration reorganized several times to facilitate this new regional responsibility. So these are all performative acts of inclusion that was driven by this underlying logic of regional responsibility. Yet at the same time, there were other logics shaping Australia's approach to refugee issues, border security issues, asylum seeker issues. Remember, moral geographies of forced migration management emerge and are underlined by ideas of inclusion and exclusion. Who's in place, who's out of place, who belongs and is legitimate versus who doesn't belong and is illegitimate. And the Fraser government, while certainly adopting regional responsibility, that was a contingent adoption of regional responsibility. It was hedged by border externalizations. And the goal was to limit boat arrivals. So yes, we have a regional responsibility, but we're also associating the region with a certain risk, a risk that the government would lose its ability to choose its own refugees, who and how many. And I traced the notion of this risk back to that first foundational document of Australia's refugee policy, formal refugee policy, in which the authors, I think is the Joint Senate Committee of Migration or something like that, talked about the camp system and kind of talked about the camp system as this great way of managing asylum seekers. And what the camp system was, and this is the same document that articulated this regional responsibility, but what the camp system was the United States approach to resettling refugees during this time, in which the United States would use island processing centers on Guam and Wake Island, as you can see from that very same map, to process refugees before taking them to the United States. Now, the United States camp system was very much for refugees already selected who are most certainly coming to the United States. It was, to help them with language, health checks, things of that nature, to really start acculturating refugees who have already been chosen for resettlement. The way the Australian government kind of idealized this camp system was slightly different, however. Essentially from this time forward, maybe even a little bit before, the administration, the Fraser government, started publicly and privately advocating for the region to become a warehouse for refugees, that the camp system should be regionalized, and specifically that ASEAN states should expand their camps, open new camps, accept both land and boat arrivals, and warehouse those refugees in camps across Southeast Asia, detaining them, initiating kind of this logic of waiting for third countries to select them for resettlement. So this was kind of an idealized regional geopolitical division of labor in which Australia kind of imagined forced migration management as being facilitated through 4 idealized kind of states: source countries from which refugees fled, countries of first asylum, essentially neighboring countries where refugees should be housed and should not be allowed to leave, transit countries that had to be shut down. These countries that asylum seekers moved through en route to their chosen destinations. These are countries that asylum seekers transit through en route to self-selecting their own resettlement countries. And of course, Australia has, starting in the 1970s, been very much against this type of movement as being unauthorized, illegitimate. And the fourth and final type of countries, these self-declared resettlement countries that aren't countries of first asylum, aren't transit countries, but rather these are the countries that select refugees who have the ability or are legitimate in selecting their own refugees, who and how many, for permanent resettlement. So starting in the 1970s, while Australia was practicing regional responsibility, Australia was also initiating a series of border externalizations to ensure that refugees were immobilized across Southeast Asia, awaiting selection by third countries. And so it was a strategy of containment. These Southeast Asian states should be countries of first asylum. And Australia initiated all kinds of border externalizations to ensure or best ensure that asylum seekers were contained and immobilized in ASEAN states. So these are these practices of exclusion. So there are practices of inclusion, the selection of refugees from camps, but also practices of exclusion, trying to ensure that refugees stayed in camps. And starting in around 1978, Australia primarily performed these type of border externalizations through diplomatic efforts to try to encourage ASEAN states and incentivize ASEAN states to accept land and boat arrivals and detain them in special processing centers. In 1978, Australia initiated a number of multilateral meetings with ASEAN states, the United States, other third countries as well, to try to incentivize and convince ASEAN states to do this. Australia even agreed to help fund Indonesia's new island processing center on Galang Island. The Philippines also agreed to open up a new processing center. And so, as you can see, offshore processing far predates the Pacific Solution and Operation Southern Borders. Rather, Australia was advocating offshore processing, albeit in a slightly different demeanor or kind of offshore processing, as far back as the late 1970s. Australia also performed, the Department of Immigration also performed different types of border externalizations. Immigration officials were deployed to countries of first asylum to sink and to discourage further boats from leaving these countries of first asylum. So to discourage irregular migration, immigration officials have admitted to sinking boats. Immigration officials were deployed across Southeast Asian camps to spread rumors that Australia would turn back boats, even though the Fraser government was against turning back boats. They thought it was not politically feasible. And of course, the goal of these border externalizations was to maintain Australia's position as a self-declared country of first asylum, to limit boat arrivals, even though the Fraser government ended up accepting around 2,000 refugees who arrived by boats. But the idea was to preserve as best as possible Australia's position as a self-declared resettlement country. And this regionalized camp system, this combination of regional responsibility and regional risk, really materialized and is kind of laid bare in the Orderly Departure Program and the Comprehensive Plan of Action, in which ASEAN states agreed to serve as countries of first asylum, to not turn back boats, and not to deflect refugees arriving on land, and instead keep them in these special processing zones, special processing centers for third country selection. So what you see from 76 to 83 is this, Australia's moral geography of forced migration management manifests in this combination, this duality of regional responsibility and regional risk. Regional responsibility and the camp system. Regional responsibility being contingent upon Australia's ability to generally select their own refugees, who and how many. In 1983, a new Labour government came to power. By this time, Australia had already resettled around 70,000 Southeast Asian refugees. A new Labour government came to power under Bob Hawke, as I'm sure you know better than I do, who was actually one of the first to advocate boat turnbacks and deportations during the 77 national election. And there's also a documented growing anti-refugee politics across Australian society. And this was very much not only anti-refugee politics and asylum fatigue, but also anti-Asian immigrant sentiment more generally. And the new government certainly embraced this. So you see across government documents, across Department of Immigration annual reports, all kinds of references to the need to diversify resettlement, a need to globalize Australia's refugee program, a need to no longer discriminate against the world's refugees by operating a regional resettlement program, but rather accept refugees wherever they may emerge across the world. So you see this effort to articulate and legitimize global responsibility as opposed to regional responsibility. And these have to be thought about in relationship to one another. The advocacy for global responsibility is a rejection of regional responsibility. Advocacy for accepting refugees from Central America under this logic of global responsibility was most certainly a politics of scale initiated and done in relation to the notion of regional responsibility. You can't separate the two. And so you see this notion of global responsibility being performed by the geographic expansion of Australia's resettlement program to Central and South America, expansion of the Middle East component, and expansion to Africa. The opening of new immigration offices, the deployment of new immigration officers abroad. So you see the selection of refugees and the resettlement of refugees from new places during this time. And of course, there's not perfect correspondence between this attempt to normalize and legitimize global responsibility and a rejection of regional responsibility, because of course, Southeast Asian refugees across the 1980s and into the 1990s still were the majority of those resettled, but this is a clear politics of scale to pivot away from that. Now, so while global responsibility emerged in the early 1980s, by the late 1980s, it was coupled with a notion of global risk. This idea that we're in a new age of asylum seeking and regular migration, where the boat people could come from anywhere. So again, all across government documents, immigration documents, Senate documents, you see discussion of jet age asylum seekers, the risk of asylum seeking irregular migration emerging not just from the region, but from anywhere. So no longer is this just a regional risk, but we're now in an era of a global risk. And so what you see is the emergence of kind of how we contemporarily think about Australia's border externalizations, the globalization of the camp system. By the early 1990s, there was this effort to internationalize the camp system, to deploy border externalizations to wherever asylum seeker boat arrivals may originate or transit through, whether they're countries of origin, countries of first asylum, or transit countries. So you see by the late 1980s and early 1990s in particular, all kinds of border externalizations that we typically associate with the Pacific Solution or Operation Sovereign Borders. And of course, again, there's not this perfect correspondence between discourse and action or discourse and performances, because most of these materialized in the region or in South Asia and the Middle East. But the mentality that Australia had to target asylum-seeking refugees, asylum-seeking irregular migrations wherever they may be, because there's now this global risk, was most certainly adopted. So from Indonesia to Iceland, wherever a potential boat person may emerge, Australia adopted the mentality that we need to deploy resources to contain them there. So there was very much a globalization of this logic, of a border externalization logic. So bringing this all together, through time, we can most certainly think about how Australia's moral geography of forced migration management has been influenced by scale, first the region and then the global. But connected to this, there have also been these logics of authorized versus unauthorized mobilities, legitimate refugees versus illegitimate refugees, places of belonging and places of those who do not belong, mobilities that are legitimate versus illegitimate. And these determinations really shaped an assemblage of practices and performances of border externalization, exclusionary practices, but also refugee resettlement and aid, these practices of inclusion. This discourse that some are legitimate and some are deviant. And scale combined with these discourses of authorized versus unauthorized mobility are really kind of the underlying logics of Australia's moral geography of forced migration management that last to this day. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. That's a very interesting paper. It sounds like it's a very well-developed one as well. So thanks for sharing that with us. I'm going to open the floor to questions. So feel free to use the raise hand function. It's probably the best way for me to see your questions under reactions. or if you're not able to talk, I can keep my eye on the chat. Does someone want to start us off? Oh, Umut, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Joshua, if I may, this is just a brilliant paper and I think a wonderful framework. But I particularly like your idea of scale and how it is performatively produced over the last 5 decades. I think one of the most important part of your paper is that when we discuss refugee politics in Australia, we mostly focus on we start the history from the Tampa crisis, and you kind of historicize the entire process, which I really like. I think which it is one of the most, it is the strongest part of your research, I think. So my question is a bit theoretical one. I'm really interested in your conceptual framework and this scale politics, if I put it correctly. Do you think there could be other case studies other than refugees in Australian politics, border politics, or global border politics that we can think in this conceptual framework? Or you develop this conceptual framework specifically based on this case study?
Thank you for the question. So I developed this framework looking at originally looking at Australia's overseas public information campaigns and the kind of logics that they articulated about irregular migration. A paper that I published in a geography journal, Environment and Planning C. I have since built upon that to think about moral geographies of migration management much more broadly, whether they include refugees or normal immigrants. As I said at the beginning of the talk, I most certainly think politics of scale have shaped the international refugee regime going back to the 1951 convention, where it was geographically circumscribed to refugees who fled Europe. Across a time going back to the 1950s, to the protocol in the 1960s that globalized it, to the UNHCR's advocacy for regional approaches to forced migration management that started really in the late 1980s when the Comprehensive Plan of Action came into force. And they've been advocating it really since. There's been this politics of scale emphasizing the region. We can most certainly see how other countries also shape their refugee policy related to scale. So maybe a decade ago, there was an earthquake in Haiti, devastating earthquake in Haiti. The Obama administration allowed Haitian refugees to come to the United States. What was the logic there within? Haiti's close to the United States. There were already Haitian immigrants in the United States. There are devastating natural disasters all over the world that the US government didn't allow people to come to the United States. But rather there was this idea that proximity engendered a special responsibility. Same with Cuba, the wet foot, dry foot policy. Not any refugee fleeing a communist regime was allowed to come to the United States of their own free will during the Cold War or thereafter, but there was a special policy to Cuba. Why? They're close. So you can see all kinds of politics of scale, both at the national level as well as the international level. A paper that I have coming out soon, hopefully it's still under review, is a paper where I document and trace the UNHCR's and the IOM's advocacy for regional approaches, and I heavily critique it.
Okay. Do you have a book on that, or are you planning to write a book on this politics of scale? It's just brilliant.
Oh, thanks. I didn't come up with a concept of scale myself. This is a long-standing and actually kind of a controversial concept in geography because it's been adopted in numerous different ways. Some people think scale is a real thing and we're stepping on it. Other people like me think it's a performative discourse, an imaginary that we enact and act in relation to. Across feminist geopolitics, there are maybe 10, 15 papers that conceptualize asylum seeker and refugee policy in relation to scale, but pretty differently than I do. Geography, I'm a geographer, is more of a journal article discipline, in my opinion, than a book discipline, like say political science or others like sociology or anthropology. I don't have a book planned right now, but over the next year, I'll probably have 4 papers related to this idea of moral geography of forced migration management.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Anyone else? I was wondering, Josh, if no one else is going to put their hand up right now, whether you've noticed any changes, and this might be covered in the full paper, as I guess, the scale, for want of a better word, of the refugee migration crisis, or as the number of refugees has exponentially grown, has the approach in terms of scale of politics changed to reflect, because the convention and the conditions that underlined it were so different to what they are today? I was just wondering, have states made any changes in that regard?
I think it varies by state. Of course, Australia has. Maybe one of the biggest changes, and I'm not a historian of the international refugee regime, but rather I focused on Australia. But I most certainly, again, the original convention was a regional approach that was then globalized as it became abundantly clear that wars of decolonization were producing all kinds of refugee flows. Through time, the UNHCR has adopted various stances. I think states essentially, in my opinion, and Australia is a great case of this, have adopted politics of scale that legitimize their ability to deflect undesired asylum seekers. In Australia's case, boat arrivals. In other states' case, it could be land or boat. So very much Australia's adoption of a global responsibility was because they didn't want to continue resettling Southeast Asian refugees. And in fact, in 1982, they switched their criteria for determining refugees from giving a group, all Southeast Asians refugees were classified as refugees, to individual cases, where each individual refugee was going to be evaluated based on their story, based on their experience. And again, that's very much an approach to delegitimize regional responsibility and change it. So it varies by state, it varies by time. Of course, Australia has now talks about a regional solution. What's a regional solution? A regional solution is so Australia can deflect refugees from the Middle East and South Asia. So they're adopting this notion of the region, really, so they can get out of global responsibilities. So it's often very cynical. We can't take them at face value.
So the changes have not been to accommodate the greater numbers of refugees, but rather to defend against it.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, maybe the United States is an exception, but still, there are all kinds of politics of scale that have changed through time.
Thanks. We've got Amy and then Andrew.
Thanks. It took me so long to find the hands up button this time. So sorry, my question was a long time coming. But Josh, fantastic paper. Thank you so much. I always love hearing you present, and I always learn something new from you. So thank you for today. Look, I was going to ask you a question that I think you just answered previously, which was about Australia's relationship with the region today, because you talked about in the 1970s it being a balance of responsibility and risk. But it seems to me that what's happened is that the scale has slid along. And so now we think about the region entirely in terms of risk and not in terms of responsibility at all. Like, where is Australia helping Southeast Asian countries deal with the Rohingya crisis? Like, we're nowhere to be seen. So I would like, I'd like you to invite you to sort of speak about that a little bit more broader, if you would. But I do have a second question, which is about, you mentioned just then the United States. And I'm very interested in questions about policy diffusion and lesson drawing, and who's learning what in terms of these trends and processes in terms of asylum policy making. And the US has always been a big player in Southeast Asia in terms of refugee policy and refugee resettlement. And I'm wondering if you can see this. I guess I'm wanting your reflections on whether these trends in Australian asylum policy are totally driven by endogenous factors from within Australia, or how much of it has come from influence from places like the United States, or in particular the United States. So those exogenous influences over Australian policy trends. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Amy has the advantage of having read the paper, although I went on much longer than what I planned. So maybe I essentially read the paper to all of you as well. Please forgive me for that. So I'll take the second question first. That's a great question. So prior to Australia's formation of regional responsibility and kind of like a formal refugee program, Australia's refugee policy or refugee program was very much influenced by the United States and Canada taking refugees from Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, the communist bloc. And again, Australia resettled, but through the normal immigration program, there was no formal refugee visa or anything, around 300,000 refugees. And that was very much informed by the US. A lot of people trace the Pacific solution to US policy in the Caribbean interdiction policy. I don't think that's right. It certainly was influenced, particularly kind of like the naval approach and turnbacks. But as I said, Australia was adopting the camp system, attempting to convince Southeast Asian states to detain refugees in Southeast Asia, open up these offshore detention centers as far back as the late 1970s. I don't emphasize it here, but I've traced kind of the rise of border securitization, militarization, the emphasis on naval patrols, aerial patrols in the Department of Immigration, back to the 1970s and 1980s. Boat turnbacks were being discussed as late as the 1970s. In 1985, Australia released, I just found this, I may have to change the paper, by the way, and add a little bit of empirics, I'm sorry. But I just found this out. Australia released what they called the Canberra paper in 1985, which was a regional processing scheme. Again, a very much formalized regional processing scheme that was kind of also advocated by the Gillard government and the Howard government, where again, as Southeast Asian states would process and detain asylum seekers and had repatriation components, so very similar to the Comprehensive Plan of Action. So a lot of people, again, trace, policy mobilities to the US. I think it's been a combination there of endogenous and exogenous influences. Your first question, speak a little bit about Australia's approach to the region contemporarily. So, I've looked at the Operation Sovereign Borders kind of up until 2012, not much thereafter. I've looked at the Pali process, which is, of course, a forum for Australia externalizing its border controls across the Asia Pacific. I don't know much about Australia's contemporary resettlement program to what degree, Southeast Asians, people fleeing, political distance, fleeing Vietnam or China or the Rohingya are included. I don't think it's a large proportion at all. Going back to Andrew Carr was the foreign minister. Andrew Carr would talk about, the Burmese government, Myanmar is treating the Rohingya terribly, and then deport Rohingya back to Myanmar. It's unconscionable. So there's very much been kind of this double talk about regional solutions, but really that's just been about Australia mobilizing refugees, whether they're from the region or outside the region, in Southeast Asian states or South Asian states. And I think that's been pretty much consistent, again, back to the 1970s as a logic of forced migration management.
Thanks, Josh. Andrew Vandenberg.
Hi. Sorry, I've been a little bit disconnected, but here I am. Fantastic paper. I really enjoyed the continuity before and after 2000, learning about that and the importance of globalization and scale this geography idea is just fascinating. I'm been thinking myself about not forced migration, but voluntary migration into Australia, and how drastically that's changed since 2000. So I'm curious about whether you've thought about this same strategy, thinking about the conditions for changes in voluntary migration into Australia, because it's really quite different to the rest of the world. And within that, refugees, asylum seekers are around, varies of course, but around 10% of immigration. But Australia has gone from 20% of the population are born overseas, or their parents born overseas in 2000, to 28% now, possibly higher, the highest in the world.
Mhm.
And this is a pretty drastic change in the last 20 years. But from what I can see, it was accidental. There's no political party pushing it or criticizing others for pushing it. No one's claiming and no one's criticizing anyone else. It's just happened. So your analysis strikes me as very interesting, but I'm not sure about globalization versus endogenous, just calculating how can we fund universities, get all these immigrants to come in and do MBAs. How can we undermine the unions, bring in all skilled labor, drive down wages, bring in more immigrants? It's sort of a series of different things have all added up, and it's just sort of happened by accident. But I'm curious whether A, you've thought about voluntary migration, and B, what sort of conditions for the change you would think about.
So I don't know much. I would not claim to be an expert on Australia's immigration policy or program, certainly contemporary or in the past. During certain time periods, but of course we have to think about refugee policy and resettlement policy in conjunction with an immigration program, and particularly politics surrounding both become infused. Very often anti-refugee politics are, they're crowding out the immigrants that we actually want. They're crowding out the people that have done the right way. They're crowding out, future Albert Einstein. In the early 1980s, this anti-refugee sentiment, this anti-immigrant, this anti-Southeast Asian refugee sentiment was very much fused with, again, a broader reaction to perceptions that Australia was changing racially and rejection there within. So if you look at the Department of Immigration's, archive annual reports, you'll see it very much connected. We want to emphasize family ties, talking about voluntary migration. We want to emphasize kind of traditional sources of immigration. So there was very much a reaction against racial changes in Australia during this time. It was very much connected to the rise of the Labour Party in this time. I think there was also a recession in the early 1980s in Australia that was very much, this anti-refugee sentiment was driven by that as well. And so all these forces kind of combined in the early 1980s to start changing perceptions of regional responsibility, to start changing the way the government thought about refugee resettlement. So I think there's always, as you said, a combination of fumbling into policy and having a logic, a continuous logic or policy, and reacting to events and predicting events. If we can look at the reaction of the late 1980s, the kind of the sense of global risk, those reports were right. Across that time, asylum seeker regular migration skyrocketed thereafter. The crumbling of the Soviet Union, various other conflicts across the world, the rise of new technology. So whether you're for, as I am, refugees being able to irregularly travel to have a source of permanent asylum, or not, those predictions were actually correct. So there's always this combination of real events, or excuse me, of events, reactions to those events, and foresight policy. Contemporary Australia's contemporary voluntary immigration program, I don't know that much about. Of course, in the 1950s, the famous Bory Report, populator perish. You see, after the tremendous dip in immigration from the 30s, 40s, and then during World War II, a tremendous increase. In the 1990s, we can think about the rise of multiculturalism. We can think about Howard's election as a reaction to that, the rise of the One Nation Party as a reaction to that. They're definitely across the Department of Immigration is a strong embrace in the late 1980s and early 1990s of multiculturalism, emphasizing that Australia is a home to people from all over the world. So I think there is, again, a combination of conscious effort to become more multicultural and kind of like the US in the 1965 Immigration Act, this emphasis on family ties had different impacts. So the 1965 Immigration Act, which really diversified the US, opened up the immigration policy, wasn't really designed to stimulate the type of multicultural immigration that it actually did. Rather, it was trying to do some other things. But the huge response was tremendous amounts of Asian immigration to the United States, in fact. So I think you're right. There's always this combination there within.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone else had a burning one.
Can I have a follow-up?
Can I?
Piero, I think, has one, sorry. Yeah.
Andrew, you can go, Andrew, that's all right.
No, I've had my go.
Okay.
You go.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for your presentation, and probably you partly answered some of the questions that I was going to make. But through your presentations, we just got the information that we've got was basically the outcome of public policies, etc. And what I didn't get much was actually the influence of the economics and the politics towards those policies. Like in Australia, for instance, after 1983, we did change, and the economy after a few years that we struggled a bit, then it did pick up, and we've had economic growth for quite some time now. So that would have had an influence on immigration, which in turn would have had an influence on the refugee situation. And with the politics, when I got to it when you talked about Cuba, you said that the United States sort of got the Cuban refugees because they were their neighbors. Well, I mean, they were anti-communists, so I think the politics really there played quite a big role as well in attracting or accepting Cubans that left Cuba to go to the United States. So I think in my opinion, it would help a lot if you look at both the economics and the politics and how they influence the public policies that you've clearly outlined, and it was quite interesting for that. That's my statement. The question is what, and I know that you do, on the basis of some of the answers that you've given us, you are considering economics and political factors. I was just wondering whether they would come out a bit more in the presentation, or whether in your paper. I haven't read the paper, so I really can't say whether they come out a bit more in that.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement. There's only so much I can say in a presentation and write in an individual paper, but I certainly think that the political economy, as well as other political factors, are a huge influence. So, the famous Boyer report came out in 1975, had national surveys of who at the time Australians preferred to come to Australia as new immigrants. And, Britain was number one, Western Europe number two, and then, other European countries, 3, 4, whatever. At the very bottom was Asia, at the very bottom, the least preferred by Australians at the time. But then shortly thereafter, the government starts settling Southeast Asian refugees in mass numbers. I don't think that that's an accident that shortly thereafter, a Labour Party that was always, and I'm not an expert in Australian politics whatsoever, but, Hawke famously advocated for boat deflections, both turnbacks, deportations. During the 77 campaign, there was again this politics of economic refugees are coming, pseudo refugees are coming, and the Labour Party came into power and started initiating policies that were much more exclusionary than the Fraser government. And I think the economy had something to do that, but I also think about perceptions of who the ideal Australian was had something to do with that. And then you see similar politics, in the Howard administration coming to power in '96, and then of course the rise of the One Nation Party. We're being swamped by Asians, the famous quote. So yeah, I completely agree, and of course, Cuba being communist had something to do with that. I guess my point was that, as far as I know, the United States didn't have any equivalent to the wet foot, dry foot policy for any other communist states. Certainly Eastern Europeans or the Soviet Union, although the United States had a blanket policy of trying to resettle as many political dissidents and anti-communists as possible as well. So yeah, completely, point taken. I'm in complete agreement.
No, that's fine.
Did you want to follow up with your question, Andrew, before we finish off? Sorry, we can't hear you, Andrew.
Sure. I just don't want to be impolite towards anyone else.
I don't think there's anyone else with a burning question, so go ahead.
I really enjoyed the theoretical starting point, this logic around logic of globalization and scale through time, before and after these major turning points. And I think you would agree that the economics and the politics of that shapes the conditions, the circumstances, for how this logic plays out different places. The follow-up question, though, is whether the much harsher rhetoric around refugees after Tampa is a way, or whether there's a logic to it of disguising the contemporary strong increase in immigration. Well, one reason for asking about this ideological hegemonic sort of masking is that a journalist, George Megalogenis, he argues that immigration has been the most important economic driver. It's more important than productivity. The increase in population is the reason that Australia sailed through the dot-com boom, the rise and boom and bust of coal, and the education exports have become very important. There's an economic rationale behind a voluntary immigration into Australia. And so the harsh refugee policy, consensus about that by the parties of government, is a way of, is there a logic there that it's hiding the increase in all sorts of immigrants from China and India especially, but yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on this performance and the role of rhetoric since Tampa.
That's an interesting question. So I guess I'll take it in a couple of different ways. So famously, of course, Howard was a critic of the expansive immigration program, particularly diversifying the voluntary immigration program. Howard was a famous critic of multiculturalism, and I'm not an expert on how the Howard administration transformed the voluntary immigration program after taking office, but we do know that that was Howard's stance, that Howard preferred sources of traditional immigration. But of course, as you pointed out, Australia's had an extensive, a large per capita, however you measure it, voluntary immigration program for quite some time. And I would agree. I mean, everything I read about the economics of immigration, that, there's two ways. You can go through productivity, you can go through immigration to kind of grow your economy. And I think Australia's immigration program, the famous points-based system, is designed to do both. I don't know if the harsh rhetoric around refugees is a way to divert attention away from the voluntary immigration program, the scale of it. That's an interesting theory. It would be definitely a good research project, but I really have no idea. When you go to Howard's, the Tampa incident, Howard's famous speech in the midst of that election, where Howard, equated, the asylum seekers with terrorists. This was even, and of course, the Tampa incident famously happened before September 11th. But what I think was the key line, what has had and I'm not Australian, but what has had the most cultural resonance was the argument that we will determine who comes here. We will determine who comes here. We are going to determine who becomes part of the Australian nation. So when I think about refugee policy, when I think about these ideas of inclusion and exclusion, really going back to the 1970s, the idea that the Australian government would decide who becomes part of the nation and not others is the continuity. Of course, we're historicizing, we're searching for like meta narratives here. And we're applying agency where it's really a diverse assemblage of actors and actions. But for me, that's kind of like the underlying logic. But it's a very fascinating thing to think about of whether or not, it's a deflectionary tactic.
Good response. Very interesting.
I think that's a good note to end on, actually, unless I don't think there's any more questions. So thank you so much, Josh, for joining us on this Friday morning over in Singapore. It's a great way for us to end our work week. And we look forward to seeing you again, to seeing your work. I'm sure that you'll be continuing to work with our colleagues here at Deakin. So thanks everyone for coming. And thanks, Josh.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Well done. See you.
Thank you for the invite. It was an honor to speak with you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone. See you. Enjoy lockdown. Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. That was great. That was really thorough. Oh, he's gone.
That always happens, Josh.
That always happens. I should tell people at the start, hang around for a minute, but
Yeah,
we'll say thanks. But anyway.
And thanks for the suggestion, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll catch up
warm.
soon.
It's cold out there.
And warm, yeah.
Hey, Amy. Oh, she's gone. All right, see ya. Bye.
See ya.